Hi everybody, this time I'm experimenting with brushandpencil.com's powder blender and soft pastels on UArt 600 grade sanded paper. Here you can see my reference photo that I took. It was on the Gulf of Mexico, right where the Crystal River meets the ocean, so it's sort of brackish waters with islands, and the sun was just setting, and we got these gorgeous purple and magenta hues in the sky, and I just loved it. So I'm going to try to recreate that with these supplies here today. This sanded paper, I'm going to brush on the powdered blender from brushandpencil.com. Usually I use a soft tool sponge, but this time I was really wanting to experiment because my mind wonders about a lot of things. So I applied it with a mop brush, and it did not apply as well as it does with the soft sponge, but it was still fun to give it a try. And I really was curious to see how soft pastels worked with the powdered blender on the sanded paper. Sanded paper is usually used with soft pastels, and so I was just curious to see if the powdered blender would aid in the blending. So it definitely did not work as well as it does with the colored pencils that I traditionally use it with, but it was still fun. It did add a little bit more blending ability and manipulation of the color particles. So here you can see where I'm just laying down the basic shapes of where I want my clouds to go, and again, the layer of powder blender is on there first to allow for a lubrication of those color particles to be suspended and be manipulated. And I just kind of add several colors of blocking in where I want the different shades to go. And then I take my soft tool sponge and I lightly rub in circular motions to blend those colors together. And again, this is manipulating the color particles to get them to kind of go together and soften those edges of the marks. One thing that I did notice is, see right there where I rub on the paper towel? Whenever using the soft pastels, I was able to clean the sponge off way better than whenever I have the color pencil. The color pencil has binders and oils in there that stick to the soft tools, so that way if you go over a light area after blending a dark area, it will muddy up those colors. Here, if you just sort of pat the soft tool off on a paper towel and rub it, it cleans it off fairly well to where you can go over the light areas again with that powder blender and not contaminate the colors. So that was pretty cool to see that work. I also took a mop brush and before I sprayed the texture fixative, and I could dust off some of the color to lighten it up and blend those areas well. Right there you could see where I sprayed the texture fixative to secure what I had done so that I can add on top of it and build layers in depth. With the texture fixative on the soft pastels, you can definitely see the spots of where the spray hits the paper, because the soft pastel is very absorbent, where the color pencils are not very absorbent. So that was another thing that I found. But once you go over it with other colors, you can't even notice the spots of where the spray marks were. So here I'm going to spray again. Each time I do a layer, I want to spray that texture fixative to secure what I've already done. If you try to smudge around the color as you build layers, you're going to remove a lot of the color and you're not going to be able to build up as quickly. So here I'm building another layer with the soft pastels, and I add a lot of pinks and blues in together because it's going to give that magenta hue and it's going to fade really nicely. And then I add the white pastels to lighten up where I want to have some of the brighter areas. And I just basically slowly build upon each and every layer to deepen the color and get the contrast, and I love bold colors, so I'm trying to get those clouds to be very bold. So once again, I secure what I've done with the texture fixative. So now I'm getting ready to use the titanium white powdered colored pencil with the dry brush. I also take out my powder blender. The powder blender is going to act as a dry diluent to the titanium white and allow it to glide onto the sanded paper in a transparent away, and I can make it as opaque as I want to depending on how much powder blender I add. And I just sort of mix the two dry ingredients in the lid of the container. And I'm just using a filbert craft brush. I don't even have fancy brushes, so I just use little craft brushes. Again, we're just playing, so I'm not really concerned about the materials that I'm using. And as you can see, with that powdered blender and titanium white powdered color pencil, you can create really soft clouds. It makes a really great effect. I could see this also being used as a technique to create fog and smoke and things like that. So this really is kind of cool to experiment with in other ways other than mixing it with the touch-up texture and that being your only use for it. So I just sort of dry brush in circular motions, and then I kind of make wispy motions along the sky edge. As I get towards the sky line where the horizon line is, I want to make sure that my lines are very horizontal, and then they sort of flow out towards the top. That gives the viewer a perspective, a focus of the picture, and it also provides a depth where you can see that, as if you were looking at the ocean, you would see that in real life. It makes it so that it's not so flat. I wanted to add some yellow, so whenever I started to color the soft pastel down there, I noticed that it was too harsh of a mark. So I used my scrap piece of paper and I scribbled the yellow soft pastel, and then I brushed it on with a dry brush. Then of course I spray my texture fixative because I want to secure what I've done. And then I move on to the next step. The next step, I'm taking some acrylic paint. I'm using the colors that I used in the sky along with a black. So I take the blues, the purples, the magentas, and the black, and I mix it together to create the silhouette effect of the islands and the trees. I do not want to use just plain black because it does leave a very flat appearance. So by incorporating the other colors that I used in the picture, you may not notice it, but it does create a little bit more interest and depth whenever creating the silhouettes. Whenever I paint on the acrylic paint over the powder blender soft pastels, I don't notice any of it collecting into the paint, so this is working out pretty well to get the effect that I want. And I'm just using a liner brush to create the horizon line and the palm trees way off in the distance. I use my masking tape straight across so that I can get a very crisp line. You'll see here in a minute when I remove the tape how it creates a really good straight horizon line. Here I'm using a deerfoot stipple brush. This is really great because you can dip it into the paint and then just dab it onto the paper, and it creates sort of like bushes and grass, and it's very abstract when you're up close to it, but from a distance it does look like it creates that island appearance that's way off in the distance. So whenever painting and things like that, always try to remember that your mind can play tricks on you, and to think of things in abstract shapes rather than actual trees and things like that, and then just step back from it from time to time and see if you're happy with it from a distance, because when you get really up close to it, sometimes you'll end up doing things that you're not really happy with because you're too close to the picture. I just remove the tape, and then I take a minute to look at my reference photo, and then there's something always so gratifying when you remove that tape for the first time and you see that straight line, and it's so fun. So anyways, once the acrylic paint has dried, I start to work on the ocean, and you can see where there was like a faint line of demarcation where the soft pastels had fallen downward because I have the table at an angle, and it sort of messed up the colors on the bottom. I wasn't too concerned about it because I'm going to go over it anyways, but in the future I would tape that off completely. So as I build the colors and I do the ocean, I try to keep my pencil strokes in the way that the waves would be, and that will help create that texture. I also touch up the sky a little bit with my polychromos color pencils to create more definition and contrast and a little bit bolder colors that I was not able to achieve alone with the soft pastels. I also add highlights to the trees and the island areas because that will create interest and depth as well. As I build the ocean, I want to make sure that I use the same colors in the ocean as I did in the sky. And each time I am spraying with that texture fixative, and I cover up what's already been done so that I don't spray that again. So anyways, I create the ocean with the same colors in the sky so that it's a reflection. And that creates, you know, the appearance that the clouds are reflecting off of the water. I take the titanium white powdered colored pencil and I take that touch-up texture and I mix it in the lid. You've seen this in previous videos. And it's very simple. You just pour a little bit into the lid and a little bit of the powder into the lid or whatever container you want to use to mix it up in. And I just take a little liner brush and I mix it until the powder sort of crumbles and dilutes into the liquid and creates a paint-like mixture. And you can paint this on, and what's great about this is you can add it to your picture and it creates highlights, and it's still, you know, for those who want to work solely in colored pencil, this is still colored pencil, it's just in a paint-like mixture. So you're not breaking any rules by mixing your medias if that's what you're concerned about. But what I'm doing now is I'm painting the horizon line to create more of a definition. And whenever you use the white, you can highlight things, you can define things that are off in the distance. The lighter the color, the more far off it appears whenever you're doing landscapes and things like this. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a visual appearance that's farther off in the distance than, you know, lower off in the picture where it's closer to us. And later on I'm going to go over that with colored pencil so that it's not stark white. It's going to be a very bright appearance. So I'm just doing that with a liner brush and trying to stay as close to the straight line as I can, and I do mess up a little bit, but I go over that with acrylic paint. And so I'm just adding a little bit, you know, to create like a little bit of waves off in the distance. Whenever you're in the Gulf and you're in the brackish area where the fresh water meets the salt water, you're in these areas where there's lots of islands. So sometimes you won't see the waves as much as when you're out in the open ocean because there's not as much current. And so here I want to make sure that I keep that in mind as I create the water ripples. And I'm just basically using little squiggles to create the depth in the water. I use deep blues, and the darker the colors I want to use closer towards the bottom of the picture. Again, as you go farther back, you want to use lighter colors. So up front I use a lot of indigos and phthalo blues, deep purples, magentas, and then in the back I use the lighter blues and the pinks and the yellows to create the highlights in the water. So overall, this was a pretty fun piece to work on. It was, you know, totally experimental. I'm still working on the oil painting version of this on my little 5x7 wooden panel. I will not have a tutorial on that, but I will have a picture when I'm finished. I don't feel comfortable videotaping my oil painting just yet. I'm not that confident in my skills. So, but this was a fun little piece to do, and I encourage you guys to experiment with your art products, and instead of using as it is intended, go outside the box a little bit and see how it works whenever you mix it with other things. So there's my final piece with all the goodies that I used to create it. I hope you enjoyed.